In this video, we're going to go through an introduction to GitHub Pages. In this video, I have two parts. On the first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. We're going to see and get a high-level overview of GitHub Pages and how GitHub Pages fit into the whole GitHub ecosystem. So we have a solid, concrete foundation. And then on the second part, I'm going to go ahead and create some repositories, enable GitHub Pages, and deploy our first website or web pages through GitHub Pages. So first, we're going to start with the theory. So let me go ahead and clear this. Now I'm going to start with our local environment. So on the right-hand side, we have our local environment. This is our laptop, and this is where we do our work, and we're probably currently watching this video through your laptop. Now your laptop is connected to the internet, so I'm going to add like a cloud, and that will, let's say, represent the internet. The very popular way to depict the internet. Simplified, overly simplified. And now through the internet, of course, we are able to access all sorts of like services and websites. So also connected to the internet, we have GitHub, which is a service that provides different kind of like services to its users. So I'm going to create like a server here for, we'll go with this icon. So somewhere on the internet, we have GitHub, let's say GitHub server or servers, let's say. Now GitHub, one of the services that GitHub provides is it allows us to create repositories on their servers. So let me just create a folder here. So a repository is simply a folder under which we can store files and other folders. So on GitHub servers, we can actually create these repositories. So let me name this repository A. So we can create the repositories, and then we can add some folders or files to these repositories. So let me go with an XML file, let's say. Let's say I create an XML file and I like store it here on my repository. So we have repositories under that are stored on the GitHub servers. Let me have like this connection here. And then these are not simple folders where we can store files and folders. These are special Git repositories. So GitHub servers run the Git software, which is a version control software under the hood, and they are also able to track changes that happen in these repositories, in these folders. So we're able to go back in time and switch to different points in time where these files and folders inside these repositories have gone through some changes. So this is basically what GitHub provides, some storage space along with Git, so we can store files, our files and projects, and then track changes. Now, in order to be able to do all these things, like to connect to GitHub servers and then create a repository, we need some way to some kind of like an interface. And because whenever we want to visit GitHub and let's say create a new repository, we probably go through github.com and then go here and say new repository. So we need a website. GitHub needs a website, which means it also needs a web server to serve this content, this website, through which we can create new repositories. So right here, I would say that let me create another server icon. Let's say GitHub also has this web server and GitHub web server through which it provides this nice graphical user interface, this website through which we can connect and create an account and then create new repositories. So these two are connected and these are connected internally. So I'm going to use like an orange color. And then through our browser, So let me get like a browser. Let's go with this one. So on our local machine, we open up a browser, and then through the browser, we connect to github.com. So we connect through the internet. I'm not going to go through the cloud. So through the internet, we connect to github.com. And then through the browser, we are able to access this website and then create new repositories. So whenever I go here, I visit this GitHub web server, I create a new repository, I click this button, and then internally, GitHub web server connects to the GitHub servers that actually store and manage the repositories. So these are some, let's say, internal things in some internal commands. I indirectly like access and manage these repositories through the website, the GitHub website, and I'm able like to create files and delete files and create repositories. So this is like how we are able to connect to GitHub. One thing that we tend to do whenever we create a repository on GitHub, we also want to keep a local copy of that repository on our local environment, on our computer. So we can create a copy on our local computer by running the git clone command. So let me just copy this. So whenever we want to like download the repository and clone it, as we say, on our local environment, we use a command that's called git clone. So through git, so let me have like a terminal here. So through a terminal that also runs on our local environment. Let me just terminal. Let me put it, I don't know, somewhere here. So through the terminal, we run some commands and we connect to the GitHub servers. And then let's say we do a git clone repository A. So we run, let me just delete this. We are connected to the internet. So all these connections happen through the internet. So we say, okay, let me clone repository A, which lives in the GitHub servers locally. So we run this command through the terminal, and then this is a two-way communication because we send a request and then we receive back a clone of the repository. So let's have a blue color for this one. And then of course we kind of like have this repository downloaded and we have it right here on our local environment, on our computer's hard drive. Now, the thing we want to do next is to be able to synchronize these two repositories. So whenever we do some changes on the remote repository, so for example, if I add a JSON file, let's say here, let me make this so, I don't know, like a little bit smaller. Okay, let's say if I create a JSON file on my remote repository, I also want to sync my local repository. So I also want to download this file on my local copy of repository A. So I run another command, which is called git pull. So I download latest changes on my local computer. And then when I run this command, I connect to the GitHub servers and I also get the latest changes right here on my local repository. But I also want this to go the other way around. So whenever I change something here locally, so whenever I say file, I don't know, like a GIF, and when I create like something like an image here, and I put here an image, I also want to the remote repository to also contain this information. So I want these two repositories, both the local and the remote repository, to be in sync, as we say. So the way that I do it is I run another command. Let me, I don't know, let me do this like here and git push upload latest changes. So with git push, I'm uploading changes from my local repository to the remote repository. So as you can see all the time by pushing, uploading and pulling, downloading the latest changes, those two repositories, both the one that lives on the GitHub server and the one that lives on my computer, are kept in sync. So let me just push this information here. And of course, I can create as many repositories as I want locally and as many repositories as I want on the remote servers. So that's like a basic overview of how GitHub works, what actually happens on the GitHub servers, and how we can connect and synchronize repositories that live on GitHub servers and locally. Now, where does GitHub Pages come into play? So the thing is like whenever we create some repository, let me create another repository. Here I will call it repository B. And this time I want this repository to hold some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, some web documents. So let me come up with a JS file and then a file, HTML file, and then an CSS, let's say file. So I want to create a simple web page. So I start with my HTML and then my CSS for the styling and then my JavaScript for adding some cool interactivity. Sorry, no. So let me group them together. So I create a new repository. I put these files, and of course, let me. Now there are two ways I can create these repositories. I can either connect through my browser to github.com, run some commands, create the repositories, create like the web pages, and then GitHub server, web server internally works and connects with GitHub servers and it runs some commands and it creates these repositories and files. I'm not directly like accessing or managing these files from my computer. I use a web browser to connect to a website, and that website, that web server that runs the website runs some commands and allow me to create this file. So there's an indirect, let's say, connection, an indirect like management of these files. So these files live on the repository, but most of the times what we want to do with HTML files and CSS files is to allow people to visit some website and be able to download this, to render these web documents through a web browser and actually see the content of these web documents, not the source code, not the plain text files that contain like the instructions, but we want people, for example, to let me find a browser here with some nice cool, I don't know, yeah, something like this. So I want someone to visit some domain, connect to, I don't know, let's say some domain, https domain.com, and then download these files and render them on the browser and actually see the content, the styling, and let's say the interactivity. Let me add cursor, some cursor to remind us that we can also have some allow the user to interact with our web page. So how can we do this? This is where GitHub Pages come into the picture. This is how GitHub allows us to take these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, host them on a special web server, and allow people to connect through the browser to this GitHub Pages web server and access and load the content on their browser and actually see our website and our web pages. So how does this work? So first of all, let's say that we have another specialized web server, and this is, let's say, this is the GitHub, let's say GUI server. Let's say this is what provides this interface for the GitHub like features like creating repositories and managing our repositories. And this is another uh, web server that's specializing in hosting these web documents. So GitHub Pages says, okay, when you go to one of your repositories and you enable GitHub Pages, so if I go to repository B that actually has some web content, some HT files, let's say pages, So whenever we enable pages, GitHub says, I will pick this file. I will be able to access the contents of this repository internally. I will just use some internal commands, get these files. Let me make this a two-way communication. I will be able to get these files, and then whenever someone like connects to this web server, I will just send these files back, and then these files, these HTML, JS, and CSS files will be like uploaded, will be loaded by a web browser, and then the web browser will display the content of these files. So this is what GitHub Pages is all about. Have some repository that's hosting some HTML and CSS and JavaScript and maybe some images, and be able to host them on a web server so people can access these files through a web browser, and then they can actually see the content of these files. Now, as you can see, we have our files here that are hosted under the GitHub servers. We have a specialized web server that will be able to serve these files to the web clients, mainly the web browsers, but we need some kind of domain. And GitHub Pages also provides a domain for us, and also for free, specifically a subdomain. So how can we access our repository? When we have a GitHub username, an account, we have also a GitHub username. So for example, my GitHub username is Costas X. So whenever we enable pages on a repository, GitHub will create a subdomain on their web servers for us. So if I enable web pages, then GitHub will create a subdomain under HTTPS, my username or your username, and then github.io. So this is a web address, a URL. So any web client, like a web browser, can connect to this. So let me place this here, and let me add this bolt. So we enable pages, and then we automatically have a free subdomain. That's really cool. This is also some internal things, so I'm going to use the orange arrows. So anyone can now access our websites through this subdomain. The last thing I want to add here is, because we have different repositories under our username, we also need to provide the name of the repository that is actually hosting these web documents. So in our URL, we also need to provide the repository name at the end. So slash repository A. In this way, let me put it like here. Okay, and then we can like send these files. And of course, as you can guess, we can also enable GitHub Pages on like this repository. And when we enable pages on also our second repository, repository A, GitHub Pages also provides another URL. No, let me just. So I also have this like second URL. So okay, Costas X github.io repository B. So if I have two repositories, or even three or even more, as I enable GitHub Pages, GitHub will allow me to provide this subdomain and then slash the name of the repository. So people can also access a repository A, repository B. Now, if you have a cool name, and also name your repositories in an appropriate manner, you can have like some really cool domains or subdomains. For example, you might have like my cool company github.io and then slash portfolio. So if you use appropriate names, you can also have a nice looking like subdomain under github.io, and also have like a repository name that makes sense. So portfolio or products or website or whatever. And then people can connect. So that's basically how GitHub Pages is integrated into the GitHub, let's say, ecosystem and how it works. Now, we're going to switch from theory to practice. We're going to go from this high-level overview to actually creating a repository, enabling GitHub Pages, and then accessing this GitHub page from our web browser. So let me simplify this. Let's copy all this and paste it here. I'm going to remove um, some informations here. So let me just delete this repository, and then these things, we don't need them. And then we're just going to go through the steps of creating a repository on GitHub, enabling GitHub Pages, and then hosting and visiting this website. So the first thing we have to do is go on GitHub and then select new repository from this button here. I'm going to go with repository B, and then I'm going to make this public. You need to make it public if you have a free account in order to be able to use the GitHub Pages. I'm going to initialize the repository with a simple README file, create the repository, and then right here, I'm going to start by creating a new file, a new index.html file. So I'm going to go to add file, create new file. I'm going to name my file index.html right here. And then of course here I can add like my HTML. So hello world from repo B. So I'm just going to commit. Now, of course, you need to provide like an HTML tag and a body and a head. I'm just going to go with simple. I'm going to commit my changes. And then right now under my repository B, I have my index.html file, which contains this code. The next step is to enable GitHub Pages. So I just finished this setup. I have created a repository. I have added a single HTML file. I'm going to add some CSS and JS next. I did all of this by connecting through my browser to github.com, and then through the GitHub, let's say, interface web server, I was able like to create this structure internally. Now we have to enable pages. So let's go to the next step. For this, I'm going to go to settings, and then I'm going to go to pages. And then right here under the branch subsection, I'm going to pick the branch under which I want my files to be served. So I'm going to go with the branch, the only branch I have at this point, the main branch. Sometimes you see a specialized branch for the GitHub pages called gh/pages. I'm going to click save. And once I click save, you will see this message here. It says your GitHub Pages site is currently being built from the main branch. So you have to wait a little bit, maybe refresh the page until after a few moments you have your GitHub Pages ready. If you want to check the progress of this building, let's say, process, you can go here to the actions. Initially, you will see this message, pages, build, and deployment. So you see there's a loading indicator here. If you click, you can see more information about what's happening. As you can see, the build has successfully finished in just 23 seconds. Now we're waiting for the next step, which is the report build status. And then the last step, which is the actual deployment. This is where the files, after they're built, they will be deployed to the GitHub Pages web server, and then we can access our website. As you can see, all parts of this process are now green. I can also click here. This is my subdomain. So I will click, and boom, I have my website online available under username.github.io.repositoryb. Pretty cool. So we also finished this step. So this left part. Now, one thing that you can do if you want like to continue developing your like website or web page, you have like two options. You can either use the online Visual Studio Code Editor from the github.com website, or you can clone the repository locally and use VS Code on your machine to continue the development of the website on your local environment. Let's go with the first option, which is to just stay on the website, on the GitHub.com website, and use a VS Code editor through the github.com. So there's a very simple way that you can switch from your normal, let's say, GitHub repository to the code editor, and that's the, through going to the repository and then pressing the dot, the period key on your keyboard. So I'm going to press dot, and after a few seconds, you're going to see that my view changes from that simple like file explorer view to an actual editor view. So I have now an editor, and I can open up, for example, my HTML, and I can run some shortcuts that are available in VS Code. For example, I can press the exclamation point and press enter or tab to have a basic HTML boilerplate. I'm going to use like some shortcuts to quickly like move around, and also hello world from repo B. So you can pretty much do anything you want from this code editor. I'm also going to create two new files of the style.css. I'm going to give my body a background color. As you can see, I can use some shortcuts. I don't write the commands. I just use some shortcuts. So background color black, and then color would be, let's say, Indian red. And then I'm going to create, let me put this here. And then I'm going to create another app.js file. And then right here, I'm going to say alert hello world. So I have a CSS file, I have a JS file. Let me connect these two and load them through my index.html. So for the CSS, I'm going to type link and then press enter or tab to have a link with rel style sheet, which is appropriate rel attribute value for the CSS files. And I'm going to connect with the style.css. As you can see through the online editor, I can also use the IntelliSense suggestions. And for my JS, I'm going to go right here before the closing body tag. I'm going to type script, select the source, the src, and then load the app.js. So I have made these changes, and then I can commit these changes. So I can go here to my Git subsection, and I have these changes. I'm going to state all of these changes. So I'm going to press this this button. It says state changes. So it's like running git add command, and then I'm going to write a commit message. So I don't know, integrating CSS and JS, and then I'm going to commit and push. So now my changes have been committed. If I switch to the normal view of GitHub, I can go here. As you can see, all the files, I can see all the files here, and you can see the commit time is just a few seconds ago. And now I can see my changes. Now, hopefully, if everything worked as expected, I can visit the website and I can see the changes. Now, let me go to my settings and get back to the pages section. And as you will see, something has changed. So up here, after the build process is finished, you will see this message. Your site is live at blah, blah, blah. And then you can click visit site to visit your website. Now, there's I probably need to refresh the browser in order to see the changes. And as you can see, with another like refresh, the new content is loaded in my browser. The previous content is being deleted from the cache, and I can see the CSS being applied. And of course, if I refresh, I can also see the JavaScript that's running. So all the changes have been made here, and all through the online VS Code editor that's available on GitHub. Let us go to our last step, which is to clone this repository locally and then be able to access the repository and the contents of the repository locally, do some changes, push or upload the changes back to the GitHub servers, and then see the changes reflected through GitHub Pages. So I'm going to open up a terminal on my computer, if you remember, and then I'm going to say git clone repository, that's repository B. And then, of course, if I do this, I should have like uh, let me make this two-way. I should have a copy, a clone of this repository locally. So I will switch to my local VS Code editor. I'm right here. I'm going to run git clone command, but I need the URL of my GitHub repository. So I'm going to go back to GitHub, and I need this page. Go here, get the GitHub URL. I'm using SSH for my connection to GitHub. Going back to my VS Code, pasting, and then I can run a command code. It's a command line tool for VS Code, and then these commands to add this folder to my local workspace. So before doing that, I'm going to change to that repository directory. So cd repo tab to autocomplete folder, and then I'm going to say, okay, let me add this folder on my VS Code workspace. So here it is. I can now toggle the terminal off, open up the JS file. That alert message is annoying, so I'm going to turn that into console log, and then I'm going to change just a few things here. So let's say h2 cool GitHub Pages, and then maybe adding some changes on the CSS. So let's target the h2 and give it a color orange. Okay, so before committing, staging, committing, and pushing my changes, I can check the changes I made locally. So for this, I have installed an extension called Live Server. So if I open up my extensions and I search for enabled extensions, that I have installed and enabled, and I can type live, you will see I have the Live Server extension installed, which runs a local web server and allow me to like run my websites locally and check them using a proper web server environment. This is a simple web server. So if you have this extension installed, you can go to your index.html, right click and select open with live server. Let me open up with live server so I can double check from my local environment. Indeed, you can see this is a local URL. My changes have been applied. Now, since let's say I made some changes here, I don't like maybe I will add a GIF, or okay, I didn't add an image, but just so if you make some change here, of course, you have to sync the changes with your remote repository. You want also the remote repository to be able to have the same structure, So you do that by running the git push command. So I will say git push, and then these changes will be like uploaded to the GitHub remote repository. And in this way, of course, whenever we try to visit my web page for this repository under subdomain /repository A or repository B in this case, we will see the latest changes with the GIF or the changes that I have made locally and under this the subheading. So I will go back here. I've tested through my local, let's say, web server with the live server extension. Let me stage these changes. So I'm going to clear, check what's the status of the Git repository. I have 3 modified files. So let me stage them. So stage the app, stage the index, and stage the style. And then I'm going to commit applied changes. Okay, and then I'm going to push. Before pushing, let's see what's happening on the remote repository. So if I go here, you will see I'm going to refresh. And if I open up the index.html, I can see the previous changes, the previous file. Now, if I do a git push, and then I go back and refresh, you will see that the file now contains the changes. That means that if I visit my website, I will see the latest changes. Now, whenever we push something to the server, GitHub Pages actually run the build process again. So it might take a few seconds for the changes to be applied. So if I go here to actions, you will see I have to wait a few seconds because it's building. There's some new changes applied, there's some new files uploaded or changes to these files. So I have to wait for this process to finish in order to see the actual changes. So let's wait a few seconds for all of the steps to continue and finish. Let me check the website at this point. So let me see. As you can see, we have like uh, the previous changes. Well, it's almost finished. Yeah, it has finished. So let me just refresh again. I think I will do a hard refresh. It still was holding the old um, changes. Let me open the console. Okay, so as you can see, just a few seconds for the process to finish, and then we have to run a few reloads on the page so that it removes the old cached version, and we now see the full GitHub pages in orange. And if I open up the console, you will see the hello world. So my latest changes have been applied. So that's it from for this presentation. To summarize, you store your repositories on the GitHub servers, and then you can access and manage these repositories by visiting github.com through your browser. And then whenever you're ready to deploy this, the content of your repositories and have it being served as a web content, as a website, as web documents, you enable GitHub Pages, you get a subdomain, and then slash your repository, you get this website online. So everyone can visit this subdomain slash your repositories that have pages enabled, and they can access your content. We started by building the repository on GitHub and then cloning, downloading the repository on our local system, but we can also go the other way around. We can create a new repository locally. So let's say we create a repository called, I don't know, my cool portfolio. Do some changes here, like create a bunch of files, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, more pages, more folders, images, whatever. Then do a git push um, uh, on a repository that we have to create right here. So we will have to create a new repository on GitHub. Let me just and then we have to connect these two repositories, and through running git push, we will be able, like, first we have to run git add remote to connect the local repository with our remote repository, then some commands here, and then we're going to do like a git push to actually push to upload the changes, and after a while we will see our files also here on the remote repository. Then the next step, of course, would be to enable pages. And then the step after that will be to have a subdomain available that contains our new website. So we can go the other way around, like start locally, test locally, and then create a repository, connect. Okay, this is all I have today for GitHub Pages. Last but not least, you can use other Git providers for hosting your Git repositories, and also hosting and deploying your HTML documents and your web pages through a web server. We have GitLab, which is another provider. You can use GitLab to host your repositories for free. and they also supply an option for like hosting your HTML files, just like GitHub Pages. And then there's another provider Bitbucket, which is another service that allow you to store your repositories online for free and then also deploy your web documents or your websites through something that they call Bitbucket Cloud. So all three providers allow you to store your repositories online, and they also allow you to deploy your websites or web pages through a very specific like service. GitHub calls it GitHub Pages. Bitbucket, I think it's Bitbucket Cloud, and GitLab, I think it uses like GitLab Pages. GitLab Pages. Let me see. Yeah, so same uh, like name for hosting and publishing your static websites. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped. Let us know if you have any feedback on the comments section below. Thank you.